Picture this. It's around 10,000 years ago at a place called Nataruk, near what is now Lake Turkana in Kenya. And something has happened here that takes a few seconds to fully register when you first look at the skeletal evidence. 27 people, men, women, and children, are lying in what was once a lagoon edge, and none of them died quietly or naturally. Skull fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, projectile points embedded in bone, hands apparently bound at the moment of death, bodies left where they fell, unburied, unattended, in positions that suggest they were attacked and killed without warning, without the chance to run, without any of the careful burial treatment we've documented throughout this series as characteristic of how ancient humans treated their dead. Some of these individuals were pregnant women. Some were children. None of them appear to have been given any opportunity to defend themselves effectively. This isn't a hunting accident. This isn't a predator attack. This is a massacre. And it's one of the oldest, most clearly documented examples of organized, deliberate, group-on-group lethal violence in the entire ancient human archaeological record, the kind of event that forces us to ask a question most people would rather not sit with directly. When did ancient humans first go to war, and what does that genuinely, honestly mean about what kind of species we actually are? Stick around, because this is one of the most actively debated, most politically charged, and most genuinely important questions in the entire field of ancient human research, and the honest answer is considerably more complicated, more nuanced, and ultimately more illuminating about human nature than either the romanticized ancient humans were peaceful until civilization corrupted them story, or the bleak we've always been inherently violent warmongers story that tend to dominate this conversation. Both of those simple narratives are wrong, and the truth sitting between them is genuinely worth understanding properly. Let's start by doing something this topic desperately needs. Defining our terms carefully, because the word war is doing enormous contested work in this conversation, and the entire debate about when ancient humans first went to war often turns out to be a debate about what war actually means rather than a disagreement about the underlying evidence. Interpersonal violence, one individual harming another, is clearly ancient, clearly documented in the fossil record, and clearly not uniquely human, since various forms of lethal individual violence exist across multiple animal species. That's not what most researchers mean when they ask about ancient warfare specifically. What distinguishes warfare from individual violence, in most research definitions, is organized, collective, group-coordinated lethal violence directed by one group against another group. Violence that is planned, executed cooperatively, and aimed at achieving some group-level objective rather than simply resolving an individual dispute. By that definition, the Nataruk massacre looks very much like warfare, or at least the kind of raid and ambush violence that most researchers treat as the earliest, most documentable form of intergroup organized violence. But here's where the debate gets genuinely complex and genuinely important, because Nataruk at around 10,000 years ago is actually relatively recent in the full span of ancient human history we've been exploring throughout this series. The deeper question is whether organized intergroup violence of this kind was happening further back, into the genuinely deep ancient era, and whether it was a consistent, persistent feature of ancient human life or a more occasional, variable behavior that increased dramatically under specific circumstances that weren't universally present throughout ancient human history. Let's talk about the direct fossil evidence first, because this is the most concrete and most important piece of this entire conversation. Researchers studying ancient skeletal trauma across multiple sites and time periods have documented various cases of what appear to be interpersonal violence, injuries inconsistent with hunting accidents or animal attacks, including skull fractures consistent with blunt weapons, embedded projectile points in bone, and perifractures on forearms consistent with defensive responses to incoming blows. These injuries appear across the ancient human fossil record at various sites going back considerably further than Nataruk, suggesting that interpersonal lethal violence has deep ancient human roots that clearly predate the relatively recent Kenyan massacre. We discussed this briefly in our ancient murder video earlier in this series, but it's worth expanding on here specifically regarding the question of when individual violence became collective, organized, group-directed violence, because that transition is precisely what the warfare question is really asking about. The challenge with identifying organized intergroup violence, specifically in the fossil record rather than individual interpersonal violence, is that multiple simultaneously killed individuals, ideally showing evidence of dying together in a specific location from similar types of trauma, provide the clearest signal of collective rather than individual violence. Single individuals with trauma evidence could represent almost anything: personal conflict, punishment within a group, an unfortunate predator encounter that left marks distinguishable from typical animal attacks. Multiple individuals with convergent trauma evidence in a shared location provides a much stronger signature of the kind of collective, organized violence that represents something more like warfare than individual conflict. By this more demanding evidentiary standard, the documented cases of what looks clearly like organized intergroup violence cluster most heavily in the period leading up to and following the transition to more settled, resource-intensive lifestyles. The period around 10,000 years ago and afterward, when human groups were increasingly tied to specific territories with concentrated resources worth organizing to defend or attack. Nadaruk sits right at this transition, and its existence tells us something genuinely important. By 10,000 years ago, organized lethal raiding of the Nadaruk type was absolutely occurring, documented clearly enough that no serious researcher disputes it. The debate is whether it was occurring, regularly and similarly, further back into the deep ancient era of the highly mobile, less territorially fixed hunter-gatherer groups we've been primarily discussing throughout this entire series. Let's address one of the most important and most interesting arguments in this entire debate directly, because it shapes how we should think about this entire question. Some researchers, notably including arguments popularized by anthropologists like Douglas Fry and colleagues, have examined the ethnographic and archaeological record of ancient and recent hunter-gatherer societies, and argued that organized intergroup warfare is considerably rarer in genuinely mobile, non-resource concentrated hunter-gatherer contexts than popular culture, and even some scientific literature assumes. Their argument is essentially that many of the cases of violent death documented in ancient skeletal remains represent individual conflict, personal disputes, or within-group violence rather than organized between-group warfare, and that the kind of sustained, organized, group-directed violence we typically mean by warfare became significantly more prevalent, specifically as groups became more settled, more resource-concentrated, and more territorially fixed in ways that gave them specific things worth organizing collective violence to defend or acquire. The counter-argument, presented by researchers including Lawrence Keeley in his influential and genuinely sobering book on ancient warfare, examines a different set of evidence, and arrives at a darker conclusion, finding that the rate of violent death in various ancient and recent small-scale society skeletal samples is, when examined carefully, quite high by modern standards, suggesting that interpersonal and intergroup violence was a genuine, significant, and unfortunately rather consistent feature of ancient human life, rather than a relatively rare exception that increased only with civilization. This debate is genuinely unresolved in the research literature, with serious credentialed researchers on both sides marshaling genuine evidence for genuinely different conclusions, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that rather than simply declaring one side definitively correct. What the evidence does seem to support with reasonable clarity is that something like raiding, defined as relatively small, opportunistic, coordinated attacks by one group against another for specific resources, mates, revenge, or territorial access, appears to be considerably more ancient and more broadly distributed across ancient human populations than large-scale, organized, sustained warfare between large groups with defined military strategy and explicit territorial objectives, which appears to require the kind of resource concentration, population density, and political organization that generally emerged with more settled lifestyles. In other words, the question, when did ancient humans first go to war, may have two different answers depending on whether you mean raiding-scale intergroup violence, which appears to be genuinely ancient, or large-scale organized warfare, in a fuller sense, which appears to be considerably more recent and more tied to specific social and environmental conditions. Let's bring in something genuinely fascinating regarding chimpanzees here, because this is where the evolutionary biology of ancient human violence starts getting both more uncomfortable and more illuminating. Researchers studying chimpanzee behavior across long-term field sites in Africa have documented behavior among our closest living relatives that has been described by some researchers as strongly resembling the kind of coordinated lethal raiding that may represent the earliest form of ancient human intergroup violence. Chimpanzee communities have been observed conducting what appear to be deliberate, coordinated incursions into neighboring community territory, specifically to locate and kill isolated individuals from those neighboring groups, behavior that increases the territorial range and resource access of the attacking community over time. This behavior involves genuine coordination, apparently deliberate avoidance of direct engagement with numerically equal or superior groups, and specifically targets vulnerable, isolated individuals in ways that look strikingly strategic rather than simply reactive. The documented existence of this kind of coalitionary lethal raiding in chimpanzees has led some researchers to argue that the deep evolutionary roots of this behavior predate the human-chimpanzee divergence, meaning some form of coordinated intergroup lethal violence may have been present in the common ancestor of both humans and chimpanzees, and may therefore represent an evolutionarily ancient behavioral capacity that ancient humans inherited rather than invented. This doesn't make it inevitable or universal, since plenty of populations of both chimpanzees and humans show highly variable rates of this behavior depending on specific ecological and social circumstances, but it does push the potential evolutionary roots of organized intergroup violence considerably further back than any human-specific fossil evidence can currently directly confirm. Now let's talk about something critically important that the debate about ancient warfare often glosses over: the enormous variability in rates and patterns of intergroup violence across different ancient human populations. Because this variability is actually one of the most important and most informative things the evidence reveals. If ancient human warfare were simply an inevitable, biologically determined feature of human nature expressing itself uniformly across all populations and all circumstances, we'd expect to see relatively consistent rates of skeletal trauma, evidence, and massacre sites across different ancient environments, time periods, and population types. What we actually see is dramatically variable rates, with some ancient populations showing extensive skeletal trauma evidence suggesting high rates of violent death, while others from comparable time periods show remarkably little evidence of violent death, suggesting either dramatically different actual rates of violence or dramatically different patterns of who was dying violently and leaving recoverable remains. This variability is crucially important because it suggests that organized intergroup violence in ancient human populations wasn't some fixed, constant background feature of human life, but a variable behavior that increased dramatically under specific circumstances and was less prevalent or organized under different circumstances. The circumstances most consistently associated with increased evidence of organized intergroup violence in the ancient record include resource concentration and scarcity, the combination of abundant resources worth controlling, and competition for those resources, population pressure, increased population density relative to available resources, reduced mobility, more settled or semi-settled populations that were more tied to specific defensible territories, and possibly certain social and political organizational changes that made coordinating larger-scale collective violence more practically feasible. This finding is genuinely important and worth sitting with directly, because it suggests that ancient human propensity for organized intergroup violence wasn't simply an expression of some fixed, immutable, violent nature, but a variable behavioral response to specific environmental and social conditions. A response that increased when those conditions intensified and decreased when they relaxed. This is simultaneously less pessimistic than "we're inherently violent warmongers," and less naive than "we were peaceful until civilization corrupted us." It suggests something more complicated and more interesting. We appear to have a genuine capacity for organized intergroup violence that activates and intensifies under specific conditions. Conditions that were apparently less universally present in the deep ancient era of highly mobile, relatively low-density hunter-gatherer groups, and more consistently present in the transition to more settled, resource-concentrated, territorially fixed ways of living. Let's talk about something genuinely important regarding what ancient warfare, when it did occur, actually looked like in practice, Because the popular image of massive, organized ancient battles with two sides lining up against each other is almost certainly wrong for the deep ancient era we're discussing. The evidence from Nadaruk and from ethnographic documentation of recent small-scale society raiding patterns suggests that ancient intergroup violence was almost certainly characterized by ambush and raid rather than pitched battle. Coordinated attacks on vulnerable individuals or small groups caught in disadvantaged situations, probably timed and planned for maximum surprise advantage and minimum risk to the attacking group. This is exactly the kind of coalitionary raiding behavior we discussed regarding chimpanzees, and it makes complete strategic sense for groups whose primary concern is maximizing benefit while minimizing risk to their own members. Pitched battle, where two roughly matched groups engage directly and openly, is actually a strategically strange choice for most small-scale societies because it maximizes risk to all participants for an uncertain outcome, while ambush and raid minimizes risk to the attacking group while maximizing effectiveness against a surprised, disadvantaged target. This means the warfare most relevant to the deep ancient era was almost certainly not the kind of organized, frontal, large-scale military engagement associated with later historical civilizations, but something considerably smaller, faster, more opportunistic, and more focused on specific, limited objectives like eliminating a specific rival, acquiring specific resources, or removing a specific territorial competitor. Let's address something genuinely uncomfortable but genuinely important here, because intellectual honesty throughout this entire series matters, and this topic particularly demands it. The evidence that some form of organized intergroup lethal violence has genuinely ancient roots, possibly extending back into the pre-human evolutionary lineage we share with chimpanzees, doesn't tell us anything simple or deterministic about modern human violence or modern warfare. The enormous variability we've documented in ancient violence rates across different populations and circumstances tells us clearly that this capacity for organized violence is a potential, not a destiny, something that activates under specific conditions and can be dramatically reduced or essentially eliminated under other conditions. Many ancient human populations across long stretches of time in specific environments appear to have lived with remarkably little organized intergroup violence, not because they were genetically different from populations with higher violence rates, but because their specific ecological and social circumstances didn't activate the conditions that seem to drive organized intergroup violence to high levels. This is an enormously important finding for anyone trying to use ancient human history to understand anything about modern human violence, because it tells us that the behavior is environmentally and socially contingent rather than simply biologically fixed, which means the circumstances that activate it can in principle be modified, reduced, or restructured in ways that significantly affect whether and how much organized violence any given human population experiences. Let's talk about what the transition to more settled lifestyles did to ancient intergroup violence rates, because this is genuinely one of the most important transitions in the entire story. We've discussed throughout this series how the period leading up to agriculture and settled community living involved significant changes in ancient human social organization, resource access patterns, and territorial relationships. Several researchers specifically studying the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer to more settled semi-sedentary lifestyles have found evidence suggesting that violence rates increased substantially during this transition, with skeletal trauma evidence showing significantly higher rates in populations that were becoming more territorially fixed, more resource-concentrated, and more tied to specific defended locations. This pattern makes complete theoretical sense. Highly mobile populations have relatively limited connection to specific territories because their survival strategy depends on flexible movement across large areas rather than defense of specific concentrated resources. If conflict with another group threatens to escalate, a mobile group can simply move, avoiding the conflict through spatial flexibility rather than needing to win it through organized violence. A semi-settled group that has invested substantially in a specific location, built structures, stored food, established productive relationships with specific local resources has considerably less spatial flexibility for conflict avoidance and correspondingly more motivation to organize collective defense and potentially preemptive offense against groups that threaten access to those specific, location-fixed resources. Let's bring something genuinely important here regarding what the weapons evidence tells us about the organization and intentionality of ancient intergroup violence, because this connects to themes we have explored across multiple earlier videos in this series regarding ancient weapon development. We discussed in our Thumbs and Guns videos how ancient human weapons technology developed progressively from simple throwing toward increasingly sophisticated projectile delivery systems. The same weapons technology that made ancient humans effective hunters made them effective at organized lethal violence against other humans. And the forensic evidence of embedded projectile points in ancient human bone, clearly from human-made weapons rather than natural objects, provides direct, unambiguous evidence of deliberate, weaponized violence in specific ancient skeletal remains. What's particularly significant about the projectile weapon evidence in the context of organized intergroup violence is that projectile weapons enable exactly the kind of ambush and raid violence we discussed earlier, killing from a distance without requiring direct close engagement, maximizing damage to the target group while minimizing risk to the attacking group. The development of increasingly effective projectile weapons across ancient human history wasn't just a hunting technology improvement. It was simultaneously a violence effectiveness improvement, and the same accumulated weapons knowledge we've documented throughout this series as being transmitted across generations through evening fire, culture would have included accumulated tactical knowledge about effective intergroup violence alongside everything else. Let's circle back to Nadaruk one final time, because it deserves a final direct engagement given that it opened this entire video and represents the clearest, most documented specific instance of what appears to be ancient organized intergroup violence in the entire archaeological record. 27 people died there, violently, at roughly the same time, showing evidence of multiple types of attack consistent with an organized assault rather than random individual conflict. This was real. It happened. And it tells us that by 10,000 years ago, at a site near a resource-rich lake in Kenya, human groups were capable of organizing and executing collective lethal violence against other human groups at a level of intentionality and coordination that leaves little reasonable interpretive doubt about what occurred. What it doesn't tell us, and what no single site can tell us, is whether this represents a typical feature of ancient human life across all populations and time periods, or an event at a specific place and time where specific conditions had driven a specific group to organize and execute this specific level of coordinated violence. The answer, based on everything the broader evidence shows, is almost certainly somewhere in between. Ancient human groups possessed the capacity for organized intergroup violence throughout an enormous stretch of human history. That capacity was activated to varying degrees under varying conditions, and Nadaruk represents a specific, tragic instantiation of that capacity, operating at a particularly organized and lethal level. So when did ancient humans first go to war? Based on the Nadaruk massacre evidence and comparable sites suggesting organized lethal raiding clearly present by 10,000 years ago, the chimpanzee behavioral evidence suggesting the evolutionary roots of coalitionary lethal raiding predate the human lineage entirely. The ancient skeletal trauma evidence suggesting various forms of interpersonal and possibly intergroup violence across the deep ancient record. The dramatic variability in ancient violence rates across different populations and circumstances suggesting environmental and social contingency rather than fixed biological determinism, and the clear association between increased settlement, resource concentration, and territorial fixity with increased organized violence rates across the transition to more settled lifestyles. The honest answer is layered and genuinely important. Some form of organized intergroup lethal violence is almost certainly genuinely ancient, possibly predating our specific species entirely in some evolutionary precursor form. But the scale, frequency, and organization of that violence appears to have been substantially more variable, more circumstance-dependent, and less universally constant throughout ancient human history than either pessimistic or optimistic popular narratives about ancient human nature tend to acknowledge. Ancient humans went to war when specific conditions made collective violence the most available or most effective response to specific challenges, and lived with considerably less organized violence when those conditions weren't present, exactly the kind of complicated, contextually variable answer that the actual evidence supports and that neither simple narrative about human nature can fully accommodate. And maybe that's genuinely the most important takeaway buried in this entire difficult topic. We are neither the peaceful, noble savages that one romantic narrative proposes, nor the inevitable warmongers that the bleakest version of this story suggests. We are a species with a genuine capacity for organized collective violence that our evolutionary history handed to us, and an equally genuine capacity for avoiding, managing, and structurally reducing that violence under the right social and environmental conditions. Ancient humans demonstrated both capacities, sometimes in the same populations across different periods, sometimes in neighboring populations simultaneously. The capacity was always there. What determined whether and how much it expressed itself was everything else: the terrain, the resources, the population pressure, the social organization, and the accumulated cultural wisdom about how to manage intergroup relations in ways that didn't require everyone to end up like the 27 people at Nataruk.